Thank you. I'm here today. My name is Erlend. I'm here with Alejandro, a colleague, and we're going to talk a little bit about testing React Native apps with Detox. But just quickly, before we dive into the very, very exciting world of end-to-end testing, just a little warm-up slide. Does anyone know what this is? Any suggestions?
It's an old ancient coin.
It is. This is a Yap stone or a ray stone. It's from a small island in Micronesia in the Pacific Ocean called Yap, and it's made out of limestone, which does not exist on this island. It exists on the island of Palau, which is 400 nautical miles away from Yap. So some 100 years ago, some enterprising Polynesians got on their rafts, sailed 400 nautical miles across the open ocean, and carved these rocks out of limestone and brought them back. And then they started convincing their fellow islanders that these rocks was something you just had to have. So this became a form of currency on the app, and they started trading them. And these rocks, like you can see, they come in different sizes, but some of them are so big that they're basically impossible to move. So when they changed hands, when they were traded, instead of moving them, they would just sort of openly agree that now this stone belongs to somebody else. To the point where even somebody actually, at least according to oral history on the app, somebody lost one of these stones coming back from Palau, but they all agreed that it was still valid, so it could still be exchanged for goods and services. So this is essentially what we do at Akka. We help you move your stone money around, hopefully a bit more efficiently. And being a payments company, testing is of course essential to what we do. We can't lose people's money. We've been testing mostly on the back end, and front end testing has been sort of haphazard and manual. I'll get back to that in a second. But yeah, so any talk about testing is basically cannot be complete without at least mentioning Mike Cohn's testing pyramid. And what we're going to talk about today is, of course, this little top of the iceberg up here called automated end-to-end tests. But that, just because we're doing end-to-end testing, doesn't mean that you can neglect your unit tests and integration tests. So don't end up with testing ice cream cone, where all you do is automated end-to-end and manual regression testing. Even though you have an electric toothbrush, you still have to floss. So write your unit test. So why do we want to automate QA? So hopefully at least every week or two, your development team adds another couple of features to your application. And that means that every week the scope of QA grows pretty much linearly. So then by the end of the year, even though your development team perhaps hasn't grown, you're going to have to either grow your QA team if you're doing manual QA, or you're going to have to expand your release cycles, or you're going to have to start automating. So enter Detox. So what is Detox exactly? It's an end-to-end testing framework for mobile applications. It's cross-platform, which in this case means it supports both iOS and Android. It's test runner independent, so you can use Jest, you can use Mocha, you can use pretty much whatever you want. You might have to write some glue code if you want to use something really exotic, but in essence you should be able to choose your test runner independently. It's also gray box, which is something I'll come back to in a second. So what does this exactly look like? So this is a Jest test, but in testing through Detox. So you have your typical Jest test, you have some sort of component that you're describing, and then you're testing for some specific type of behavior. So in this case, the login screen should let you log in with valid credentials. And then typical Detox test starts out with just reloading the application to reset its state. And then you can search for elements by ID and enter text or interact with them, tapping login buttons. And then in this case, you would perhaps expect some sort of welcome message or something after you log in, and you're also expecting that the username and password form should be gone. So I mentioned briefly, this is a gray box framework, so what exactly does that mean? Well, let's contrast it with Blackbox testing, which is sort of more the traditional way of testing end-to-end. So Blackbox testing operates and inspects the app from the outside. It has no knowledge of the internal state of the application. So a typical example is, for in this setting at least, would be Appium, which has sort of been the go-to tool for testing mobile native applications. Appium under the hood uses UI Automator and UI Automation, and the only information that these two actually have is predominantly just your view hierarchy. So whatever the state of your view hierarchy is, that is all it knows. So the result of that is that you often have to add sort of sleep statements or do various hacks in your tests to actually make them pass in a reliable manner. And we started out writing Appium tests at Akka like 3 years ago or so. I spent about a month writing gherkin scenarios and all the glue code that you have to do for that, and then adding sleep statements all over the place. I mean, we could never get our test suite to reliably pass every time. And then at the end of that like 4 or 5 week period, iOS 8 I think was released and nothing worked. And that was sort of the end for Appium testing at Akka. We gave up at that point. So contrast this to Detox. Detox, or Greybox frameworks, it runs in the same process as your application. So this means it does a little bit of instrumentation. You have to build your app in a slightly different way. So Detox takes care of this for you. But it's good to be aware of, because it means that you're not actually testing 100% the same thing as you're releasing. But the trade-off is that you get more stable tests. So it has access to the internal state of the application, and Detox uses the information to synchronize your test for you, basically. So instead of all these sleep statements, Detox looks at network activity, it looks at active animations, it looks at activity on the main thread, the rendering thread. And in React Native's case, it looks at the React Native rendering thread, which is asynchronous. And then it uses all this information to sort of say, okay, is the app in a stable state? And if not, we're just going to sit and wait. So when you click on or when Detox clicks on that login button, it fires off some requests to the server, there's a bunch of activity going on. It maybe starts a transition to a new screen. And then only after all of that has stopped and the app is sort of calm again, Detox continues on to the next statement and sort of starts running your expectations and looking for new elements on the screen. So looking at the same process, but from a slightly different perspective, this is sort of the flow of tests in Detox. So you have your test runner, Jest or whatever, and it runs some sort of expectation through the Detox framework. Detox then has a server that's spun up in the background. And the reason for this server is so that it can manage having restarting your app and restarting your simulator without sort of losing the state of the test itself. Detox then, so this is serialized JSON sent to Detox. Detox passes it on to the test framework on the application. And then here's something that's missing, but the test framework then translates it from JSON and into either Earl Grey or Espresso, which are two frameworks for doing native testing on iOS and Android. And then, like I said, once the application is idle, this Earl Grey or Espresso expression is then executed, and the result is then passed back to your test. So with that, I'm going to pass the word on to my colleague Alejandro, and he's going to talk you through. We've put together a little demo application. The source code will be available on GitLab, so you can sort of play with this yourself afterwards. But yeah.
Hello. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So how many people have heard about Harvest? Not so many. Harvest is actually the software that we use at work to log in our hours. So basically, once we get to work, we log in our hours, and just before we leave, we stop those hours. And we set up this demo together because we thought that it was actually a pain in the ass to just log in your hours every time you go to work. So it's better that you come and then you have your phone who's going to do that automatically based on your location. So the demo we're going to do is actually that. We're going to track time based on the user's location so that we can log in hours into the Harvest API. And then once we leave work, those hours are going to stop. So the demo consists in 3 different screens. We have the login screen, which is basically a web view. Then we have the location screen, which is actually where we wrote most of our tests because we needed to play with the location, with the see if a user was online or not. And finally, we have the hours screen, which is actually where we are fetching all the data and all the hours from the Harvest API and showing the ones that are currently running or actually the ones that are not running. So before we dive into those screens and the tests that we have written, I just wanted to show you how a test in Detox looks like. Then you can see you have 2 different files. You have your component and you have your test file. And the most important thing that you can see in the component is that here you have these props that normally you don't have in a React Native app. That's the test ID, and that's what tells Detox what he's going to test and how things are going to look like. So in your test, you basically there's a small typo here, should be unavailable. Sorry about that. But yeah, location should be unavailable, and then we make use of the device object provided by Detox. We launch the application. Once you launch the application, you can send some arguments. So we send the permissions, and in this case, we say location is not allowed. Then we find an element, and we find an element with this ID, and then we click on that element. And once we click on that element, Detox should wait for an element with an ID error to be visible. And therefore, that test should pass. If we dive a little bit more into each one of these screens, we have different use cases. So the login screen, as you can see, is just a web view authentication using OAuth. And it's a web view. And unfortunately, web views are not supported in Detox. That means that, according to Leo, software engineer at Wix, he suggests that we should mock our API and do not display the web view. So to solve that problem, we need to mock some components. In order to do that, we need to tell Detox. You see, just open this. Yeah, we have our package.json. So we have 2 different scripts here. We can run yarn start or we can run yarn e2e server. Yarn start is just going to launch the web server using React Native, and this one is going to launch the web server using Detox. So once we run the normal one using React Native, we're going to use the default sources here, and then therefore we're going to run the login screen, the normal login screen that the user actually is going to see, which is that one, the one that we released. But in order to test that login works, we need to run this one, which is the Detox server, and then we create a new platform to run a new component, login screen.e2e, and that one is going to look like that. So that's how you basically do the testing in Detox when it comes to web views, since it's impossible to test web view at the moment by Detox. In practice, this is how our component, you see the login E2E component looks like. Again, the first thing you need to look at when you write a component is just to add your test ID, because then you can write your test and you can expect Detox to do actually what we need to do. So we launch the application. Just go here. We launch the device. In this case, we set permissions location to always. Then we find the element ID, which is this one, to replace stateful token. Then we find the element, which is the button, this button here, and we click on that element. Once we click on that element, we have here our harvest, which is our mocking server, and then we expect actually to get the user information based on the mocking. I think Erlend is going to get a little bit more into details. And therefore, we expect, we expect an element with ID button location to be visible, and that means that we actually switch into the next screen, which is the tab that I'm going to show you now. So once we switch into this one, we have the location screen. Actually, this It's only one screen, but it says if the user is online or user is not at work. So since this is a demo, we needed to start making some assumptions, and we made two different assumptions. The first one is that the work location, the user location are going to be the same the first time the user installs the app. It's just a demo, so it was like, yeah, we need to start from somewhere. And the other one is that we have, if the user is at work, we can tell that the user is at work if the user is actually within 50 meters in those two locations, with the work location and the user location. So then from that assumption, from those assumptions, we have two different use cases. The first one, if the distance is below 50 meters, then we can assume that user is at work because work location and user location are close, and therefore we start an entry in Harvest. And in the other hand, if the distance is more than 50 meters, then user is not at work, so then we just stop the clock. That in practice looks like that. For the location components, we wrote like 5, 6 different tests. But I just want to show you one of them. So here again, you go to a location screen component, and the first thing you go to test ID, user status. In the location test, you launch the application with the permissions and locations always, and delete to true. That's going to do a fresh installation of the whole application. After that, we go through the authentication process. We log in. We talk to our mock API, and we're going to get a response of a time of entries. And those entries, since the user is at work, we set the location, and then we expect an element by ID user status, which is that ID that you see in the text, to have a text user is online. If that happens, that means that the user is at work, and the test should pass. And then finally, we have the hours screen, which is just basically going to show the hours. Those are actually currently running or not, so it's just a flat list with a list item. So you have the hours screen component, and here you have two different test ID. You have the first one, which is basically a variable, which is going to be changing based on the time entry. We launch the application again. We expect the mocking API to get us our information. Then we need to make sure that we are in the tab hours screen. So we click on that one. We expect all the time entries. And then we expect an element by ID running with an ancestor of time entry to be visible. So that's basically that's basically the way that you can test when you have different test ID and one test ID inside of the other. Use the with ancestor method. And then you expect an element not running with ancestor time entry 2 and time entry 3 respectively to be visible if actually those classes are not available. Yes, so I just wanted to show you right quick how you build the application using Detox. Just so I don't break anything here. Looks a little bit bigger than it should, but yeah, so first you need to do Detox build. That's going to build the whole application. And then you do Detox test configuration, and then the release mode. And that actually shows all the workflows. Let me just put a little bit down. It's going to be the application and do all the tests that we have done. So this time starting for the location. Yeah, and if you want to dive a little bit more into details of the code, as Erlend mentioned, we have the repository, but you see now in this time, the user didn't allow location, so we should see that error. Then we're doing a new launch of the app, and we send the argument delete true, so that's going to do a fresh installation to actually change the permissions. So once you click there, user is online, then when you're online, we check the location to see actually is online or not. So those are some use cases that we test. Those 4 locations should be unavailable, user is at work, user is at work and leave the office, and user is at work, leave the office, and then comes back. And then we have the hours, which is basically going to fetch all the Harvest timers that the user have. And mocking our server should have 1 which is actually running and 2 that are not running. So with that, I'm just going to go back to the presentation. I'm going to hand it over to Erlend.
Yeah, so one of the questions that we asked ourselves when we started doing detox testing at ACA was to backend or mockend, so to speak. So the question is, do you run against your own environment and run an actual backend server, or do you just mock it somehow? And I guess the answer is it depends on how complex your application is. For us, running the backend in a convenient manner as part of our end-to-end testing was just not possible. It's not feasible, really. But if you're able to, I mean, the process of doing that is you get the real user experience. It's quite easy to, well, depends on your environment, but it's easier in a way to set up because you already have servers running. The tests are often easier to write because you don't have to know that much about what the server actually responds with and so on. And in the end, it gives you a higher confidence because you're actually testing against the real environment. The cons are it's usually quite flaky. It will be really hard to get it stable. Your backend is usually dependent on some other third-party service that you don't control. And so then you either have to write your tests to accommodate for that, or you have to rewrite your backend to sort of mock out the parts that you don't want to include in your testing. It's usually quite slow and it's hard to maintain. However, if you mock your backend, it's easier to maintain. It's nice to have sort of expectations and assertions kept closely together, so you can have all that in your tests. It's more stable, but it's usually harder to write. Because you have actually, when you're writing the tests, you actually have to have fairly deep knowledge of what endpoints are being called, what is this response supposed to look like. And so we've done a little bit of trial and error. We had for a while, we had our QA guy writing tests against real backends. Because for him, sort of mocking backends and figuring out these responses was quite difficult. And then we've tried to sort of take that and then convert it into mock backend tests after the fact. So to do that, we looked at a few different options. There's a project called, I think, JSON server or something like that, which lets you sort of put up a folder full of fixtures and then serve it based on just sort of folder hierarchy and JSON files. Me personally, at least, I didn't really like that because it sort of puts all your test data in one place and your tests in another. And then you also have to write all your tests to sort of accommodate for what fields are defined how and in various ways in your test data. So this particular person ID, for instance, is disabled or. So we started writing our own little mock API. It's a simple little script, a few hundred lines. It's based on Express server. So then you can write these little expectations in your test where you sort of specify the endpoint and the method and then what kind of status code you're supposed to respond with and the content of your response. We still have some kinks to sort of figure out in the way we set this up. But generally, we've been quite happy with this approach. So, to summarize, thanks to the gray box architecture of Detox, the tests are a lot more stable than any other kind of end-to-end testing framework that we've worked with on mobile. That being said, it's still a lot of effort to write these tests, and especially tests that involve a lot of backend communication. Requires a lot of time and effort to sort of gather all the data and all the responses and put them together in a test that's stable. So my advice is to focus your efforts on the critical parts of the application, perhaps especially things like activation, which your developers often don't do that often, or usually don't do that often themselves. At least for me, I often just go through the activation process once and then the rest is just sort of reloading the application over and over again. So those features are good to cover with automated tests. And of course, any sort of critical part of your application, like sending and receiving money, it's good to cover with automated tests. Source code is available on this bit.ly/detox demo if anyone is curious to take a look at it. And that's basically our show. Any questions?